PHP includes a second mechanism that we can use in order to be able to better share code between pages and between projects. This second way of being able to share code is something that works cooperatively along with functions. It doesn't take the place of functions, nor does functions make this particular technique unusable. They work together very well, and this particular technique also tends to work real well in situations where we're not specifically dealing with functions, sometimes where we're just dealing with particular code snippets or reused chunks of code, or possibly even code that isn't itself PHP, HTML code, CSS, and JavaScript. Basically what we're looking at here is a handful of functions that PHP makes available to us. The roots of these functions are generally the word require and the word include. The require function, the include function, which has to be spelled correctly of course, are the basic two functions that we'll be talking about here. And both of them also have a second version that goes along with them. This second version that goes along with them is require once and include once. What both of these or all of these statements essentially come down to is really sort of in a way a type of import. Whenever we require something, we basically just specify a file name that we want to have imported. Same basic thing with include. Whatever file it is that we've said that we want to have included will simply become a part of our script. Will be imported, will be copied and pasted, or simply dropped in at the point where we've said that we wanted it. Here, let me comment out all of those functions except for just the basic require function, and let's practice with this a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new file. Here's my new file. I've just named it sample_file.txt, and I'm just going to put a little text in it. This is some text. There we are. I'll save it as it is. Back over in my main file, if I have need of the content of my sample_file.txt file, all I have to do is require it. So I'll just require sample text, it's sample file.txt. There we are. And when I pull this page up in my browser then, when I refresh, we end up seeing the text from my sample file has been essentially imported and dropped into my PHP script. So at the same point in my PHP script where I asked to have that file required, PHP went out, found that file, and simply dropped it into that position. If the file that we're going to require exists in a different directory than the directory that our file is in, we can of course include a path to that file so that PHP is able to find it. The file itself that we create can have any name and any extension. Here I've created the file and I've called it .txt, but there's certainly nothing wrong with .php. As a matter of fact, requiring other PHP files is the most common way that this is typically going to be used. So you have a lot of flexibility. It's very sort of free form, exactly what it is that you have the ability to require. It simply takes whatever file you've required and essentially imports it into the position where you've asked to have it required. This can be wonderful with things like functions, because when we write a useful function, we might very well want to be able to use that function on multiple pages. Well, instead of having to copy and paste that function onto each individual page, which in a lot of ways defeats the purpose of the function in the first place, what we could do instead is we could take the function, put it in an external file, and then simply require that file on every page that has use of that function. So if that's the way that require works, how does the include function work? Well, the difference between what require and include essentially comes in a situation where we have an error condition. What is it, how is it that PHP is going to handle a file not being found, for example? If I were to ask require to require a file called sample.php, which doesn't exist, what I'm going to also do in here is I want to throw in a couple of echo statements, one before and one after, so that we can see what's happening before and what's happening after the file is imported. So here, before the file is imported, I'll put a break in there to help keep things clean. Let me also create another echo like that here after I've done my require, after the file is imported. Maybe I'll put a break in front of that one as well. There we are. All right, so I have my two echoes in there. I have a require statement that's trying to require a file that doesn't exist. Let's see what that looks like in the browser. That's what we end up with. If you take a look, you see that the echo statement that says before the file was imported is there. Then I have a warning from PHP saying that it couldn't open a stream to the file it's trying to read. Then I got a fatal error. Fatal error, of course, is about the worst type of error you can get, in a way, the most severe, maybe I should say. Fatal error basically here, of course, occurred because PHP was not able to find the file that I asked it to include. But one of the important things to note about it is that PHP abandons executing a script whenever a fatal error occurs. So when I tried to import a file with require where that file didn't exist, that caused an error of a sufficient severity that PHP actually stopped executing my script. Nothing else in the script happened from that point on. Let's try the same thing again, but let's try using the include function. With the include function here, if I try to require a file that does exist, or include, I guess I should say, a file that does exist, so I'll go back to the proper file name with the .txt extension, you can see that it works really exactly the same way that require did. When everything is working properly, there doesn't seem to really be any difference between require and include. Where things get different is what happens when you try to bring in a file that doesn't exist. We saw that with require, it causes such a severe error that the rest of the script is abandoned, is not executed. Here with include, what happens is, again, we do see warnings. These warnings, of course, though, could be hidden on a production server, so maybe they would never show up at all. But the important thing to notice is that all we got from include was 2 warnings, no fatal errors. And my last echo statement, the one that executes after the import is supposed to be done, still executed. So really the difference between require and include is what happens when something goes wrong. Include allows things to go wrong and allows your script to go on executing. Require does not. With require, whenever something goes wrong, it completely abandons running the rest of the script. So I suppose there's a choice there to be made in different circumstances as to which behavior you want if a file doesn't exist. I can tell you that personally, in my own personal experience, I almost always use require. Because almost always, anytime I am trying to import a file, it's very important to me that that file be imported. I have not, that I can recall, run into a situation where if a file that I was trying to import was missing, I considered that to be okay, and that I wanted to then just go on and keep working as if everything was normal. So because of that, I almost always use require, but include is there waiting in the wings in case I ever come up with a situation where a missing file is considered to be an okay thing. The require once and the include once functions are simply just 2 other versions of require and include. They work exactly the same way, importing a file, whatever file you specify. The only big difference is that require once and include once will keep track of which files have already been required or included. They then prevent you from requiring or including a file more than one time. Well, why in the world would I ever require a file more than one time? Am I going to type require my file and then type require my file again because I forgot that I just typed it a moment ago? That's usually not the situation in which this happens. Instead, what typically occurs is that you might require a file, another PHP script, which itself might require another file. Maybe that other PHP script needs that other file. It literally requires it. So it has to require it, but you need what's in the other script, so you have to require that one. Maybe you then require another file, and through this tree of requires, your script requiring other pages, those other pages requiring others, and maybe those requiring others still, it's entirely possible that in those chains that develop, the same file may end up being asked for more than once. Well, having a file imported more than once is like typing duplicate code into your page more than once. Sometimes it just means that the code is duplicated, but sometimes it will actually cause problems. Like what happens if I try to declare a function twice? Well, PHP won't let me have 2 functions with the same name, so that would result in a problem. Let's play with this a little bit here and see how this actually goes. Let me change my require statement back over to the proper file name. There we are. And over in that file, let's put something in it. Let's try declaring a variable. I'm going to make a variable over in this other file. I'm going to call it external variable, and I'm going to give it a value of 11. If I come back over to my PHP script then, the one that's actually doing the requiring, at that point if I try to actually access that variable, I'm going to say echo the external variable is external variable, external var, I guess technically is what I called it. Let's see if that actually works. If I jump over to my browser, hit refresh, it comes back and says this is some text, $external var equals 11. Then it tells me I have an undefined variable, external var. The reason that's actually occurring is that just because I'm importing an external file doesn't mean that I magically get to stop using my PHP tags. Any PHP code that I want to put into an external file still has to be marked as being PHP code. So let me set up a set of PHP tags here, and I'll move the declaration of my external variable into those PHP tags. If I then go back and try and run this in the browser again, now everything is working just fine. It's a little bit peculiar in a way, because over here in my external file, I'm writing everything as if it's PHP with PHP tags and everything, but the file itself is not actually a PHP file. The file ends in .txt. As far as PHP is concerned, any file that you try to require or include, it's going to treat it like it's PHP no matter what the extension on the file name is. That's why I told you before it was very free form and you were allowed to put in whatever extension you would like. Just for clarity, what I might actually do at this point is I might actually come and change the file name itself to avoid any confusion about the fact that there's PHP in that other file. So let me actually go rename the file. Here we are. I've actually renamed my file, so now my file's name is actually sample_file.php. That helps me a little bit when I'm playing with it here because, of course, my text editor now recognizes it as being PHP and color codes it as such, so it's a lot easier on the eyes. If I actually create a variable over here in my main file, let's say a variable called internal var, I'll give it a value of 7, would I be able to access that variable in my external file? Well, let me jump over to my external file and let me put in an echo and give it a shot. I'll say echo internal var is $internal var break. If I go back over to the browser now and hit refresh, there we are. You can see internal var is 7, so that seems to be working fine. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of issue with accessing variables between these two files. A big part of the reason there's no real issue accessing variable between the two files is that they really aren't, in the final result, two separate files. Once the external file, or what I'm referring to as the external file, gets actually included, or required in this particular case, to be more specific, it's not really a separate file at that point. At that point it becomes a part of this file, so of course the variables are able to be seen by each other. Really what happens here is that PHP is going through sort of a two-step process, the way it kind of always does. PHP essentially is going through my main file, and everything that's PHP code is essentially left as it is. Everything that isn't PHP code is turned into something like an echo. So by the time it's done with this file, the entire file is essentially written in PHP code. When the PHP server sees me requiring the other file, it goes to that file and it does the same process. Everything in here that is PHP code is essentially left as is. The PHP tags are stripped away, and everything that isn't PHP code is turned into something like an echo. It then takes everything from this external file and essentially copies it and drops it into place in my main file in place of the actual require statement in this point. So what I really have at that point is just a file full of lots of different PHP statements. Some of those PHP statements originated in this file, some of them originated in a different file, but at that point it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. They're all here together, and at that point PHP server then goes through and executes all of those lines, which ends up generating the output, which is of course then sent back to the user's browser. So as far as these variables being declared in different places, when they're all brought together with the require, they're all usable side by side. The same basic thing then of course is going to happen for us with functions. If I create a function over in what I'm calling my external file, here I'll just make a function called sample. I'll just have it do an echo. This is a sample function, is what I'll have it print out, or output more appropriately. There we are. Okay, that sample function was declared over in my sample file. If I come back over to my main file and I actually call that sample function in my browser, you can see the line this is a sample function has shown up, so I was able to call that function just fine. Of course the same thing's going to go the other way. If I happen to have a function declared here in my main file and I were to call that function in my sample file, that would work just as well. So nothing to it. The two files become one. They can access each other's resources with no problems whatsoever. It's in situations like this where I start declaring functions in other files that things like the require once might become important. Just to kind of give you an idea, here if I were to type require for my sample file twice at this point, when I go and refresh, you can see I get a fatal error telling me that I cannot redeclare sample, the sample function. So because I've put that file in there twice, that file has been brought in here twice, which means I have two identical declarations for the sample function, which PHP does not like to see at all. This is where require once could help us. If I change these two requires over to require onces, which is kind of a funny thing to say, require onces, what's going to happen is PHP will require it the first time, but then when it goes to require it the second time, it'll check first, did I already require this file? When it sees that it has already required the file, then it will simply ignore the second require once. It will not come back and actually import that file a second time. In the browser, the error at that point actually goes away. So being able to require or include, require once, include once, all of those, it's a great way to be able to share code. You can simply fill these external files with code that you want to have shared. Very often that might take the form of function libraries, where you could write a handful of functions that have to do with whatever domain your particular project is dealing with, and then you could require that function library in that external file into all the separate pages that need it. All those functions would then be available for all those different pages, and the beauty of it is that all those functions are only written once. They exist there once in that external file. So there's only one place that you ever have to go to modify them, correct them, update them, do any work with them at all. This require and include business, though, also works great for things other than functions. Very often, I see people use it for things that are just simply HTML. You might notice here on my page, for example, I have an empty header that appears up above the content of my page. Well, if I was creating an entire website where perhaps every page was supposed to have the same header with some kind of navigation in it, what I could do is I could actually take that header and I could put that off in a separate file. Let me take that header from this file and I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to start a new file, I'm going to paste it in there, and then let me save this file. There we are. I saved the file as _header.php. The basic name of the file is just header.php, but a personal habit I have, something that I like to do, is that when I create a page that contains a small snippet of some other larger page, like here we have just the header that's supposed to go into other pages, I often will put an underscore as the first character. When I'm looking through a busy directory full of lots of files for a project, it makes it a lot easier for me to be able to tell what are real pages and what are just what I think of as being page snippets or page partials. What I can do here is, now that I have this file called header.php back over in my main file where that header was previously written in directly, instead, I could put a set of PHP tags in there, and I could just require that external file that I've created. So I'll just require header.php. When I look at that again in the browser then, everything looks exactly the same as it did before. Technically, this gray space up here is the actual header. Doesn't look like a whole lot right now, but that's what it actually is. If I go back over to that header file and maybe I put a h1 tag into it, I'll say require and include example, kind of the name of this example. If I go back to the browser now and hit refresh, you can see require and include example shows up as my little header up there in my header section. So if this were a website that I was creating and every page on the website required, imported essentially, this little header snippet, then by adding something to it or changing something in it, every page on my website would then reflect that change. So again, these require and includes give us a very powerful mechanism for being able to reuse code, even if that code isn't necessarily itself PHP code. Require and include are very useful tools. You can go pretty far using require and include to do this sort of thing. You might sometimes hear people refer in PHP to templatizing or making a page template. What we could do is we could go through and take all the different parts of a page that are common, maybe all the links that I put up in my head section, for example, maybe a header like I've done here, maybe some navigation or a sidebar, maybe a footer down towards the bottom. I could take all those different parts of a page and I could actually move them over to a separate files, little snippet files, so that those could then be imported into all the pages of my site and be more easily managed that way.